This is Friday, April 13th. This is session 5005, a climate conversation. In this CWA session, we will utilize both the CWA app and a note card system to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the Schedule tab Q&A, and then insert and send your question. You may also raise your hand or request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers here on the side, and you must write legibly. If you're a student, please note this in your question. Students' questions get preference. Make your questions brief and to the point. Before we get started, we would like to mention that this session is underwritten by the CU Environmental Center, which is helping us to reduce the CWA's environmental impact. The center's support has enabled the CWA to purchase carbon offsets for speaker airline travel, to reduce its paper consumption by creating our app, and to promote our live streaming platform and to offer free HOP bus service. We encourage you to make use of these resources during your time at the CWA. So this is a conversation, which means we're very much looking forward to your questions of the panelists, who I'll introduce briefly. Unfortunately, Naomi Oreskes will not be with us. She wasn't able to attend the conference this year. But we do have Dan DeLure, Francisco Zamora Arroyo, and Alexander Verbeek, who are going to each give a little bit of an intro from their perspective, their organization, their thoughts about climate, and then we'll take your questions of them and ask them to respond to your questions and or to with each other. Dan, who will go first, Dan DeLure is the founder and president of the Wedgmere Group in Washington, D.C. Francisco is the director of the Colorado River Delta Program for the Sonora Institute, and Alexander Verbeek is a diplomat from the Netherlands, an environmentalist, a public speaker, and an associate at the Stockholm Environmental Institute and Stockholm International Water Institute. So with that, I'll ask Dan to start it off. They'll each have, like I said, about 10 minutes of an introduction, their organization's views, conversations about climate, and please, please submit questions to us so we can make this a true conversation.
Okay, thank you. I'm a guest speaker. This is my first day at CWA. I was here for the entire week last year, but having not been here, if you've been on a climate track during the week and I repeat something that's been talked about, I apologize in advance because I don't know what was said earlier in the week. My background quickly is in the electricity industry. I'm a former executive with a large electric utility. I've had my own firm in Washington, D.C., had my own firm for about 15 years, and I've specialized in what is now being called grid modernization, smart grids, smart meters, microgrids, storage, distributed resources, and so on, a lot of which I know is happening here in Colorado as well as elsewhere. So that's the approach that I come at climate change from. I've been active in the climate change policy debate for a long, long time, even when I was a utility executive, which I don't have time to go into. But I also have my own accredited delegation to the UN climate change process known as COPS. So I guess this is a case of where we talk about whatever we'd like to talk about. So here's my list. First of all, quickly, don't misunderestimate grid modernization and all of the change happening in the electricity system as something that might apply more directly to addressing climate change. I mean, thinking about renewables is easy, but the whole idea of grid modernization is wringing every possible iota of waste out of the electricity system by optimizing it with new technology. And that's good for climate change, as well as it handles the problem with the intermittence and variability of some of the renewable energy forms. So, the one thing about electricity, it has a very structured policy process that you can get involved in as a climate advocate. The other thing about electricity, of course, is that when you clean up the electricity system by adding renewables and everything else, then anything that is electrified becomes cleaner. And that is one of the great things about the move to electric vehicles and the move to electrification in general. What you're talking about is the gift that keeps on giving, as a friend of mine likes to talk about, because as the grid gets cleaner, everything else is cleaner as well. One of the things I'm working on these days is carbon pricing. I was asked to toss out a solution or two. I think carbon pricing is one of those solutions, but it's damn hard to do. The state of Washington just tried to do it for the second time and couldn't do it, and they're going right back at it the third time. But in terms of trying to price externalities into the system and have something that people don't have to think about, I think that's the way to go. I want to give a shout out to an organization that I'm currently trying to help out called the Citizens Climate Lobby. Anybody here from CCL? Great. Okay, yeah, I would encourage, if you want to belong to something and try and help do something on climate, that you take a look at them. They're a grassroots organization, and they have a focus on carbon pricing. And so when they talk to a policymaker, they have an ask. And I know from all my years in Washington, it's important not just to talk about an issue with a policymaker, but you want to have an ask, saying, do this. This is what I want. This would be good. I want to talk about the timetable for a moment as I look at my clock running over here to my left. And this is what I spend probably too much time, although maybe too much time is not enough. And that is the timetable of climate change and the timetable of what's being done to address it. Of all of the studies and reports that come out, and they're coming out quite frequently now, and I can talk about how you might follow that in an easy way without getting into the depths of all of the scientific channels and so on. But you may remember last November, the administration in Washington released a national climate assessment, much to the surprise of a lot of us, saying, how did that get out, given the administration's stance on climate change? Well, actually, it was because over a decade earlier, Congress had mandated that every 4 years, 14 federal agencies get together and release a national climate assessment. So this last November was volume 1, and it's specific to the U.S., okay? Even though climate change is a worldwide issue, it's specific to what is going to happen in the U.S. Volume 2, coming out in October, I believe, is going to be even more specific. It's going to talk about the impacts in different areas of the U.S., different regions. It's going to be something that allows better focus on what some of those impacts can be. But when I talk about the timetable, that National Climate Assessment and those scientists that produced it, their number is 20 years. Okay, their number is 20 years, and we will, at the present pace of things, used up our entire carbon budget in order to stay at 2 degrees. And you've probably heard about the 2 degrees, and maybe some of my fellow panelists can talk in more detail about that. But 2 degrees is kind of the magic number that's been decided that we don't want to go beyond. Even with 2 degrees, we're going to have some impacts we don't like. But 20 years is not a long time. In fact, the Paris Accord was actually at 1.5 degrees, and some of the experts there talk about even a matter of a few years when we will have come pretty close to that. So I think this is the biggest problem that mankind has ever faced in a conceptual way. I think it's so hard to think about something that builds up and has a lag effect in terms of its impact. You probably all remember acid rain. And acid rain happened when emissions in the Midwest fell down pretty quickly. I'm from upstate New York. They fell down on me and the Adirondacks and everything up there. And then when rules were passed, when scrubbers were put on the stacks in the Midwest, then acid rain kind of stopped. The sulfur dioxide wasn't there to fall out as acid rain. That's not what CO2 is, or the other greenhouse gases. I mean, carbon dioxide itself, I think it's 25% of the CO2 that goes up is going to stay there for 200 years or more. And so all this time, even today as we sit here, the concentrations in the atmosphere are building up. And that's not something, in fact, if there's something else like it that we face, I would like one of you to tell me about it so I can maybe add that into my thinking. But so then what do we do about that? How do we turn to some sort of, if it's happening on a daily basis, how do we turn to daily actions that would address it as individuals? And I'm not sure. I mean, I've tried to think of ideas. I know I have a lot of friends who are environmentalists, and too often I'm turning off the lights in their house because they do that professionally, but they don't do it at home. And we're all guilty of that. I mean, I like the idea that weather men and women on the news are starting to take climate change seriously, and they're starting to talk about it in their broadcasts, and I think that's a great idea. I think, you know, newspapers and nightly news might begin to talk about it more without getting into too much of an advocacy role, but just playing the role of reminding everyone that the clock is ticking. Maybe there should be a clock. I think that sounds kind of silly, but I don't know. Maybe there should be a clock somewhere. You know, recently I actually bought an app. It was $2, and I bought an app that told me I would get reminders during the day on the fact that I wasn't going to live forever. And seriously, and this is a popular app. I wish I could remember the name, and maybe I can look it up. But it would come up and just remind me and say that, you know, hey, you know, you ought to concentrate on what you're doing, type of thing. And I don't look at it anymore, but it was really too much. But anyway, the idea that I just think that out of sight, out of mind is the biggest problem with climate change. And then lastly, as I go to my last few seconds here, is back to that 20-year timetable. 4 years is a big chunk of 20 years. And, you know, the Trump administration at 4 years, those 4 years have been pretty important. And think of what maybe could have been done with those 4 years. And so as we head into future elections, I really think voters need to think that way, that this is a real present and imminent danger that has to be addressed. And it has to be, even with all sorts of individual actions, it has to be addressed. And finally, don't count on the feds. You know, I mean, greetings from the swamp. What else can I say, okay? And I used to defend the swamp, but it's getting hard to now. But cities are a place of action. States are a place of action. And that's where I think the focus has to be to really crank down on emissions and address climate change.
Yeah, go ahead, Alexander.
Just before I walked in here, somebody came to me and gave me a present. Seems to be a new tradition. This is a mug. If you put in hot water or tea, the map of the world is changing because it shows the sea level rise. So, talking about reminders, I mean, I love your app, but from now on, every morning when I wake up, oh gosh, we're drowning.
That's a good one.
Which is good for somebody working daily on climate change, and basically my job is to remind everybody about what's going on and to work on solutions and bring people together to tackle, as you just said, the biggest problem in our lifetime. To follow up, since this session is a bit less structured and we can just flow every way we want to go, let me follow up on what you just said on the 2 degrees. When the scientists were quickly learning more and more about the climate change, they concluded at a certain moment 2 degrees should really be the maximum that we want to do. By the time that, and that was the Copenhagen, the 15th Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC, where the UN talks about climate. In Copenhagen, this 2 degrees became accepted as the thing we should we should never get higher than 2 degrees Celsius. That is, by the way, I think that's 3 point something in Fahrenheit. And by that time, the scientists said already, oh gosh, what have we done? I mean, 2 degrees is too much. The 2 degrees, they defined it originally was 2 degrees, if you stay below 2 degrees, or if you are at 2 degrees, you have a 50% chance that you don't get runaway climate change. That the positive feedback loops, which is something very negative, that the positive feedback loops just kind of take over. So let's say when the tundras is melting in Siberia, that so much methane is coming out. It's its own reinforcing process. So that is a bit like you're sitting in your airplane and it takes off and the pilot says, hi guys, welcome on board. I got some good news for you. We got a 50% chance that we're actually going to land safely today. You run out and get your suitcase. I'm not going in there. That is what we now collectively decided, even though the science says it was already set too high. So we have now collectively decided that that is the maximum limit, but we aim for 1.5. We're not going to make that. I really think from all the scientists that I'm in touch with that it is extremely unlikely that we will stay below 2 degrees. If we really do our best and really all work together in a positive way in this world, we could maybe contain it at 3. But it might actually be a lot higher at the end of this century. That means drastic changes on what is going to happen on this world. And for me as a diplomat, looking from a more international perspective, one of the things that I've been working on a lot is how climate change is going to impact the security, both human security for individuals that think about children in the Sahel that have no more water, etc., and that impact all the way to international security. And just to give you a few thoughts of what we are talking about, the Potsdam Institute, some of the best scientists in the world in this field, they're actually elected as the best environmental think tank in the world in the latest annual ranking of environmental think tanks. SEI that I'm connected to was the year before the best one, and the year before that was WRI. All our excellent think tanks work a lot in this field. So Potsdam Institute came out with a study and said by mid this century, by 2050, several months a year, Northern Africa and the Middle East, large regions in North Africa and the Middle East, will be so hot that a healthy human being can just not live there. And then think about children and older people. What's going to happen there? And that is really soon, you know. Many of us will live in that lifetime and all of our children will be there. Where are these people going to? They will probably not immediately run to Europe, what many populists try to make us believe. They will most likely move to the cities. But how do you prepare the cities for that? How's there enough food for these people? How's there enough water for these people? And yes, some might go on the move. In Europe, there's now, let's say, we have 500 million people in Europe. There's about 1 million that want to move to Europe. That's already a huge influencer in politics. You see all kind of unhealthy reactions to the idea that foreigners are coming to our countries. Imagine if that number would really grow into tens of millions. Just look at the kind of political impact. So how will countries react? Will you see an increased movement saying, we're going to close our border. We don't want foreigners. We don't want to cooperate with the media. We want to go back to the old times, like, you know, our country used to be so good in the past. Let's go back to the old days, which is a feeling you see in many countries over the world. Think about Brexit, you know, we want our country back. Think about in France, the right-wing populists, you know, France is no longer safe. Think about what's happening also in all kinds of non-Western countries, all kinds of developments, and I'm not going to name them all by name, but you probably know the kind of countries I'm thinking about. So this is a kind of worldwide reaction, and it's a logical reaction. If something bad happens, let's say in your neighborhood, you also want to close the doors in your house, like, gosh, what's happening here? But the answer is, of course, the opposite. You need to work together. You need to embrace science. You need to work together not only with other countries, but also all elements in society. You need to work with business, with NGOs, with government. You need to educate people at all levels so that they can understand what's going on. And you need to work with a long-term perspective. And in practice, that is really difficult, because if you work in a business, you look at the next financial quarterly report that's coming out. If you're a politician, on average, every 2 years, you have to be re-elected. So you want short-term results. I mean, and nobody's going to thank you if you're now using taxpayers' money to build a dike to keep the water out that might be useful in 20 years from now. But you have to start building it now. You will never be rewarded by your taxpayers and your voters. So all of us should look for this long-term perspective, and we should vote into power people with a long-term visionary perspective. And that is something that we as humans are not very good at. We are not trained to really think long-term. If you see the longest term predictions that you ever read about in the newspapers is year 2100. And that's just 82 years away. And then my mug should indicate when I put in the year 2100, probably my grandchildren, then there should be, in the bad case scenario, as Noah right here has predicted, it's about 7 feet sea level rise. In the bad case scenario, in 2200, what nobody is talking about, but my daughter's grandchildren will still be living in that time, hopefully, with all the medical advance. By that time we're there. It's not that far away. We talk about 10 meters, 30 feet of sea level rise. That's the bad case scenario. It might be less, but in practice, I work on these things for years, and always we end up in bad case scenarios. But even if it would be just 1 meter, that is large parts of Manhattan underwater. That is huge parts of Florida. That's Mar-a-Lago. It is, which, yeah, okay, there are some good things about it. Okay, cheers, guys. And that's 1/3 of Shanghai. It's half of Jakarta. 8 of the 10 biggest cities in the world are on the coastline. So it's these kind of, these massive changes. Where are these people going to? How do you imagine replacing a city like Shanghai, moving it somewhere? It's probably, if one country is capable of doing it, would be China, I guess, but still. So these are the kind of things we think about. Take, for instance, a country like Egypt or Vietnam or Bangladesh or my own country, the Netherlands, where you are at delta and you're at or even below sea level. Just a little bit of sea level rise has an enormous impact, not only that you're drowning, but also the salt intrusion that makes agriculture impossible, etc. For a country like Egypt, where else can you go than that little fertile delta? The rest is just sand. I'm at 10 minutes. I'm stopping here because I was given 10 minutes. I got 10 minutes and 2 seconds. This is the best timing I had. So, Francisco, it's yours.
Well, I do get in trouble with my wife because I always asking her, turn off the light. Don't use that much water. And with my son and my daughter, and even with my sisters and my parents. So what can we do? That's a question I ask myself. What can I do on a daily basis? And I like that, I think my approach this morning will be, what can I do on a daily basis? And not only at home, not only about the resources I use, but from my field, I'm a scientist on one side, but a conservationist on another side. Sometimes, of course, as a scientist, I look at the scientific reports, and I like data. I like to know, the facts. But on the other side, as a conservationist, I look, at my heart, what my feelings are, what should I do as a human being. And it's not easy. It's not easy, but I agree with the comment about, the action is at the local and city level, state level, because at that level, at least in Mexico, I grew up in Mexico. By the way, I grew up in Mexico City, so we're at 2,000 meters high, so I guess sea level rise is not going to affect us. But of course, that's not the only impact of climate change, sea level rise. In my field, we work a lot with water in the Colorado River, and we already seen 15 years of drought in the basin, and a lot of challenges in terms of how use water or how better do a better job in water conservation. And I say it's not easy because 80% of the water in the basin, or I guess between 75 or 85%, depending on where you are, goes to agriculture and the rest to cities, and zero to the environment. So now you can imagine how hard my job is trying to find ways to secure water for the environment when the expectation in the future is the water supply is actually going down instead of increasing. And so the cities are thinking about how to get enough water. Farmers they not only want the same amount of water, sometimes they want more water because of the demand of crops and food. And I guess not that many people are thinking about the environment or dedicating water for the environment. And so what can I do and in my field, and I see a lot of students here, so I guess the question, when I was growing up, climate change was not really an issue, I guess, but now I would think that the students are getting some of that information in the schools, and we do a lot of environmental education in this case in Mexicali, in the Mexicali Valley in Mexico. So what should we teach in our students? In fact, I guess I have more questions for you guys than answers. But so what can we or what should we teach in the students now? So that we don't scare them. I mean, because some of these things are kind of a big concern, but so that they can actually look at themselves and say, okay, I'm going to make a decision to do this and do that at home and schools. For example, how about solar panels? How many of you have solar panels at home? A few. Okay. I live in Tucson. A lot of sunlight. And I don't have solar panels at home because I couldn't afford those. I'm thinking about doing that soon. But you see more people with solar panels at home in Tucson. Well, many schools have solar panels and a nice parking lot now because it's covered with solar panels. At my church, we have solar panels, and many churches now have solar panels. So it's great, some of that things, and the cities have been, I guess, kind of promoting that, and the power companies. But I go to Mexicali every week or every other week, even more, sunlight, even a few degrees hotter than Tucson. I don't see solar panels, not even in some of well, I guess some industries are beginning to do that. But at residential areas, you don't see solar panels. So, some of these things or the technology is pretty expensive. And some countries, and I imagine, don't have the resources to, bring that new technology to the residential or to people. So I guess I see that, and in Mexicali, I haven't heard the local government or even the state government to develop plans to bring some of this new technology to make it more affordable and available for people. I mean, there is wind turbines now in some of the areas. Even in Mexicali, we have a geothermal plant which supplies half of the electricity of the state of Baja California, but electricity is pretty expensive. You know, we use a lot of the air conditioning in the summer, and it's pretty expensive. You can pay a lot of money those summer months. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, what do we need to do at the local government, at the perhaps the state government level, how to transfer because in Mexico, yes, at the federal level, there is a lot of conversation about climate change, and we are part of the different, you know, the international conferences, and yes, but how to transfer that at the state and the city level and begin to do something more, I mean, take action, you know. I think conversation is good, but how we bring that to an action plan. Yeah, planning, you know, long-term planning, I think we need to do that. In the Mexicali Valley, for example, farmers, they do an annual water plan. And because, you know, I guess the expectation is that they will have the same amount of water. In this case, because Mexico gets a fixed allocation of water from the United States. And we know that that may change in the future because, you know, there might be shortages in the Colorado River Basin. And I don't think necessarily, I guess farmers are just beginning to, you know, incorporate that into the planning process, but they do, you know, yearly plans. So again, I think I like to concentrate, and I guess I'm making a commitment now with you guys and with the conference. I'll keep talking to my wife, you know. But I'll keep talking to students too. So I'm gonna learn more about, and you know, maybe the panelists will be able to give me some ideas about how to bring the information to students so that you know, they you know, have a better understanding, and in particular you know, are able to define or find ways to take action now. Thank you.
We have a couple of responses. Go ahead.
Yeah, few responses to your last remark. First of all, how important education is, and that everybody should know. Even many well-educated people still don't have a clue about what's going on with climate change, whether it's real or not. On last Friday, now exactly a week ago at this time, I was sitting with my dentist, and you know, before you sit in chair, well, what was it you're working on? Well, I'm working on climate change. Then I sit down, I open my mouth, and he's working in it. And then while he's busy, and I'm like scared, what's the guy doing there? He's saying, yeah, you know, climate change. Yeah, everybody talks about it while he's busy in my mouth. I recently saw this guy on television. He said, you know, it's two things. One is that there's like a solar rhythm, and it has always changed the climate. And then I thought, yeah, you know, while he was busy in my mouth, yeah, you know, he's right, because we had like ice ages in the past, and we didn't cause that either. And then he goes on and says, well, the other thing was plankton. It's actually the plankton is changing in the ocean, and that is changing the climate. This guy is well educated. The guy has a university degree. He's in my mouth doing whatever. And I can't say anything back, you know. And it's a bloody shame that somebody at that level of education still doesn't get the basics of that all scientists in the world agree that climate change is man-made and it's very dangerous, and that it's extremely urgent that we take the right action. If he doesn't understand it, how do we get the average voter, how do we make them understand what's going on? And we have to start with the young people. And I'm so glad you're out there in the back and that you're also listening to these things. Get yourself educated on these issues. This is your planet, and you have to be there. The other thing on solar panels, what you see with solar panels, in some countries they're very rapidly adapted and in other countries not. That is not that in one country they're more expensive than the other. That has all to do with government. And if you look at a country like the US, you see that there's all kinds of open and hidden subsidies to the fossil industry, and there's actually in quite a few states laws that make it difficult to move into solar panels, like that you have to pay extra tax when you put solar panels on your house. Worldwide, there are 6 times as much subsidies on fossil fuels than there are subsidies on renewable energy. And that is absurd. It should at least be the other way around. Actually, there should be no subsidies at all for the use of fossil fuel. There should actually be a heavy tax on fossil fuel, and use that tax to make it easier for people to invest in renewables. You don't only put renewables on the top of your roof, solar panels, just because it's cheaper for you for your energy bill. You do it for other people. You do it for the planet. You do it for all of us. That should be rewarded. And so it all has to do with the kind of world we want should be, it's a complex world, complex solutions, and you can't do that with good governance. You need governance, you need to pay for governance, you need to pay for these civil servants. So government is not something you get for free, but if you see countries, I mean, I live in Sweden, I'm not a Swede, I'm a Dutchman, but I live in Sweden. That's typically a country that has found such a beautiful balance between how much governance you have and how the industries are working and the impact of the population. And of course, I'm always so jealous, it's such a beautiful country. Everything works there like clockwork. Everybody's happy and healthy. And when I was hospitalized, when I just arrived in Sweden, it was so difficult to pay the bill because after half a year of asking, I finally they gave me a bill to pay for my insurance. My daughter has braces. She's not even Swedish. It's paid by the government. But it's a booming economy. It's one of the best economies of Europe. So you can have a good government, which is maybe expensive, but still have a very good economy. It is possible. It's doable. I'm not saying that you should become Sweden, but I wouldn't mind if you would. I'll stop there.
So this past February, I was in Aspen, the Aspen Energy Institute. Every once in a while pulls a bunch of folks like me together to talk about things. And so this was to talk about energy and climate change. So during the course of the 2 days, at one point there was a table with a bunch of us, and no one at the table, represented a utility or had any reason to try and moderate their tone or thinking about climate change. And it was one of the most depressing conversations I've ever been involved in, because everyone sort of talked turkey and, talked about, as Alexandra said, we're not going to make it. Now that statement, we're not going to make it, you've got to parse through. Okay, what does it mean to not make it? By what year are we not going to make it? What does it mean, as in the 2%? But in my opening remarks, I tried to not do the we're not going to make it thing and how bad it's going to be, because I'm trying to get people to make the logical leap that something has to be done based on timetables. And then, you said we're not going to make it. And this gets into the messaging on climate change and how to communicate to spur action. And there's research that shows that some people want to be scared. There's research that shows that some people don't want to be scared, that it simply doesn't work, they can't handle it, and they clock out if they hear something like that. And I'd appreciate, especially given the generations we have here in the audience, if anybody has anything to say about that, because that's crucial. If you really want to follow what I consider the leader in working on climate communications, it's Yale University and a guy named Dan Kamen there. I think they're doing the breakthrough work.
Great. Well, thank you. To follow up on that, I think if there's any more to add to this discussion, one of the first questions was, how do you have that conversation? If you can have an encounter with your dentist when it's not in your mouth, how do you have that conversation? And Dan, you've answered some of that, and there is some research that some people just can't handle it. But I think despite that, it's back to the messaging. We've got to find some way. So that's a burning question, I think, for a lot of people, how you might continue that conversation with whoever. So how do you have that conversation with the climate deniers and try to help them get over their discomfort and some degree of understanding and owning the issue?
Well, normally I do a lot of these kind of talks. Normally, for some of you have seen me before, and there's a kind of, I was yesterday talking with one of you in this room about how my talks often go, and in the beginning I give a few data to make you aware of what's going on, and then second half we go towards more solutions. There is so much that you can do. If you talk to a climate denier, it always helps to give the facts, and then they deny it, but maybe later at home when nobody watches, they actually read it. But it's also, it helps to show somebody what it means for yourself or for your own family. So you, for instance, you talk about your own health. If we air pollution is, for instance, something that is very much related to climate change. We talk about different chemicals, but it's often an area where you produce a lot of CO2, let's say a big industrial area, is often also an area where you have a lot of air pollution. And air pollution kills an enormous amount of people worldwide, and more data are becoming available. If you work on better environmental regulations for instance, industry or for cars, it's not only good for the environment's also good for you, but it's also good for you yourself. It's the same as I've been this week more than ever before talking about not eating meat. I mean, that's good for the environment and for the animals, by the way, but it's also good for yourself. I mean, just Google for yourself, for those that don't believe me, just go do a bit of Google search, be a bit critical, and look at what it does on your life expectancy if you eat less meat, or preferably no meat, or a plant-based diet. So a lot of things you can do for the climate are good for yourself. If you put solar panels on your roof, it's good for the environment, actually good for yourself too. In the Netherlands, where, I don't know if some of you have been there, but it's always very cloudy and rainy. It's a kind of depressing place, that's why I'm here now. But we have a lot of clouds, but in 7 years, you earn back your solar PVs on your roof, and that's without subsidies, and that's already in 7 years. And after that, you have kind of free energy, and what you produce too much, we have sun in the summer, then you feed it into the grid, you actually get it back on your electricity bill. You become an electricity producer. So your neighbor who doesn't yet have solar panels on his roof will not have to burn gas or oil or coal or whatever for his household, because he can use your energy. So there's so many kind of win-win solutions that are good for the environment and good for yourself as well. So even if I would be, well, let's go back, this is my last one here, let's go back to the same dentist. By the time he allowed me to talk again, he said at the end, well, actually, last week I was Googling for solar panels on my roof, and I found this fantastic one that's following the sun, and I think I'm going to buy it. The guy doesn't believe in climate change, but he believes in his own energy bill. Well, we agreed on that one. Thanks.
Either of you have any?
Well, yeah, I just want to get back to the idea of urgency, and this is live thinking in my mind these days as to whether to spend the effort to convert those who deny it, as opposed to spending an effort to get those folks who believe in it and get it to act and do something. And I don't know. I mean, I'm torn between that, and maybe both of them have to be done, but when you try and do too many things at once, maybe it's not as effective as you want to. But I mean, I think the urgency, I mean, we've talked about solar panels, and you see great numbers about the increase in solar energy and wind here and around the world. But those great numbers are usually the rate of increase. But the percentage as a total that they're contributing is really, really small. I mean, the simple fact is that nothing to address climate change is being done fast enough to address it.
This is getting more depressing by the moment. Okay. Well, a couple of student questions that really followed up on what you introduced, Alexander, was the role of animal agriculture. But I guess I'd broaden that to, what about, those specific contributors to climate change that we might think about solutions to, or at least different kinds of approaches? Animal agriculture would be one. You've mentioned energy production, transportation, so water. Any thoughts you have about those key contributors that we might think about a new way to look at those?
I can mention a few. Well, I guess few of you have heard me speaking already on animal agriculture, so I'll keep it short, but we are cutting away rainforest in the Amazon and other places to grow food that we then not eat ourselves, but we then give it to animals. And then there's an enormous loss of protein, energy, and everything that you put into the cow compared to what you actually get out of it. All calculations indicate that now that the world middle class is doubling in just 20 years' time, that means the people in the world that will live like us. Think about China, India, where many people are now lifted out of poverty. They all want to eat meat. There's simply not enough land to feed them. And even if we would use all the land in the world to do it, why would we cut away all that beautiful biodiversity of the rainforest, etc., to do that, when you can live so perfectly happy like I do without eating any meat? And 15 years ago, I was where many of you still are. I mean, I ate meat practically every day, and then I decided with my wife at a certain moment that on Monday we would not eat food and would not eat meat anymore. And then that became more and more, and we threw out the beef in the beginning. That's a good one to start with. And then, well, at the end, the chicken also went off the menu. And I love a plant-based diet. I feel better by it. But completely other solutions. There was recently the Drawdown Project, which where they had done research how it is possible with the techniques that we have now to stop climate change. And it is possible. A similar conclusion was drawn by Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, who had a huge project to see what was the techniques that we have now that are already available or that are nearly available, if we could reduce our emissions in the US with 80% by the year 2050. And it is possible. And you know what? It doesn't hurt the economy very much because you are also doing all kinds of new things. Think about a wartime economy, or think about in the 1960s, 70s when we were competing with the Soviet Union in the space race. So many things that we enjoy now are derived from what was happening then. Last remark on different ways of tackling the climate change problem is educating girls. Turns out in so many studies that I've read as one of the best ways to tackle climate change. If you educate girls, and now of course I'm more thinking about the global south than where we are sitting here. It might be irrelevant. Well, you have to educate girls everywhere, of course. Related to population growth, if a girl stops education at 12, on average she gets a little bit more than 5 children. If a girl finishes high school education, she gets only 2 children, and those children have a better life. She will have a better life. She will be more empowered in society just by the fact that she has education. And actually you build a better economy where in the next generation there will also be less children. Population growth is actually, it's another factor in this whole thing. We are now at 7-point-something billion people on this planet. We'll be at 11 billion at the end of this century. We have to make room for these people. So these are just a few of the many different ways how, in a positive way, you can tackle climate change. And the last thing here, all of these are win-win solutions. I spoke 2 days ago in a panel on win-win solutions, and I said, I don't like zero-win solutions because then you're a loser, but I can't find one-win solution. I couldn't find one example for myself where you do something good for the climate that doesn't have all kinds of other goodies that you get out of it. Thanks.
Just a few things about what we are doing to the environment. And so it's not only happening in the Amazon. I mean, of course, Mexico and other rainforests in other countries are being destroyed. I guess California is 80% of the wetlands in California. 80% or more are no longer there. So. But it is difficult, it's difficult to work with state and federal governments when it comes to protect the natural environment. Mexico, we have a great system of protected areas, natural protected areas, and well, there should be more. And I was in a panel yesterday about restoring the environment. We, I guess, got to the point now that we have done so much destruction that we are now in the phase or in the need to restore the environment. And of course, I'm trying to contribute to that. I mean, in restoring the Colorado River Delta, the riparian forest. Maybe it's a small amount, 1,000 acres now. Hopefully we'll double that or triple that in the next few years. But if we could, do similar things in other parts, I want to say Mexico and the U.S., well, maybe that will contribute to, not only create a better environment, but benefits to people. I guess one of my notes here was how to mitigate for climate change or how to adapt, how to help cities and people living in these cities to adapt or prepare, and at the same time have a better life in the future. So I guess now, for example, urban wetlands are beginning to be kind of a new thing. In Mexicali, we are trying to develop wetlands in the city, in the middle of the city. You have to go to Mexicali. I mean, it's not like Boulder, of course. So it's a desert. There is, all farmland around the city. So having a wetland in the middle of the city it's very significant. People can go there, and it will contribute to improve the air quality. So there are many things that we can do, but I guess I'm an optimist, and I think we should keep doing those. And somehow the students and the citizens will have to play a more important role or bigger role in continue to support these activities, because the state governments, sometimes the city governments, 3 years for the city government in Mexico and 6 years for the state government's administration, and that's it. So there is not really a long-term vision for how to prepare or mitigate. So yeah, students and everyone, we need to play a more important role, a bigger role on climate change.
Thank you. So in order to get some more questions in, because you've all been great about submitting those, I'm going to ask the panelists now, we're going to go to the lightning round, right? Where I'll ask a question and look for some fairly short and concise answers so we can get to a variety of questions. One of which comes from the student, and this is appropriate because we're on a campus. What is the role for science? Scientists historically have felt like, advocacy certainly, but even speaking in general is not our role. And yet something like climate is such a technically based issue that there has to be some role for that. So your kind of thoughts of the role for science and scientists particularly to play in this discussion?
Quickly, I'm working with the National Academies of Sciences right now to get some of the climate scientists that produced that report that I referenced earlier to appear before policymakers to explain the climate science. And it's not easy. Scientists like to talk to other scientists. They get very excited about the fact that they're going to release some new report at the annual meeting of the Geophysical Union or something like that. I mean, and they're not really good at conveying and talking in message-type talk. So I think that scientists, you've got to work with them. You want to bring them in. There's no one more credible. You can take someone from an environmental group, and there's still that hint of agenda there. But a climate scientist, in my experience, has no agenda, and you want to try and work with them.
Very much agree with that. You can't expect a scientist whose specialty is to be a scientist to be also a good communicator. Some are, some weren't and have become one, like Jim Hansen, for instance, or Michael Mann. They reluctantly were pushed by the climate deniers into that role, but you can't expect everybody to develop that way. And therefore, I always admire the institutions that are good at communicating the science to other people, and I believe the best one in that field is the World Resources Institute in Washington. If you Google on their website, the way that they translate the knowledge of scientists into what you actually need for policy action is fantastic. So, for instance, drought worldwide, there's all kinds of studies done by scientists, but the World Resources Institute puts it on a map that any policymaker can immediately understand and take action on. The way that they translate it into understandable data and take action which are accessible for everybody. Go to their website, World Resources Institute in Washington, excellent. That's the kind of good initiatives that we need. So cooperation between scientists, specialized communicators and policymakers and the bigger community.
So another one, when we talk more about acting, so what are 3 questions we should ask of any politician before we vote she or he into public office?
There's 3 questions.
3 questions we should ask of a candidate before we would elect her or he into office.
That is a good question. I'm going to say the first, and I've thought about this a lot, because you don't want to go with, do you believe in climate change? Okay, I mean, don't use that anymore, because there's too many ways to wiggle out. And you want to ask a more specific question about, what kind of timetable do you think we should be on? Do you think we're doing things fast enough to address climate change? But then I think you want to ask specifically what they would do, and don't let them, wiggle out of that. And then if they do try and wiggle out about it, ask them about a carbon price. Okay, it's a very specific thing. Would you work as a policymaker to enact a carbon price? And I realize I'm throwing that out there without talking a lot about what a carbon price is or how it would be implemented, but it is a specific thing that would be embedded throughout business and society that would go a long way towards addressing this.
My 3 questions would be, would your government ratify the Paris Agreement? Second, what will your government do about rising inequality both in the US as well as between the US and the rest of the world, or between the North and the South? And the last question, what will your government do on regulation of funding of politics by business?
Yeah, spoken as a Dutchman, yes.
I think I'll be more specific in asking about water. What would be a specific plan to better for water conservation and use water, not only during the 3 years or 6 years of the administration, but long term.
Okay. Well, it came up during this one. This is a good one. So we've talked about scientists. We've talked about acting individuals. What's the role? What can we do to actually help define and promote the role of corporations in this climate discussion?
Corporations are changing faster than you might think, especially in their thinking about climate risk. And I go back to that conversation in Aspen, and some people were talking about, corporations that are making plans to move things north, and maybe across the border based on some of their operations. Now that sounds radical, but maybe it's realistic. But I think corporations largely I hate to keep coming back around to this, but corporations endorse carbon pricing for the most part. They think if you embed it that way, then they're fine with that. The other thing is, of course, the new movement based on trying to assess risk. This, in some ways, is a shareholder movement. I think it's great, and I think that should be happening everywhere because I think it should be required of any company that they do a risk assessment as to the impact of climate change on that company.
Following up to what you just said, I found out here that the price for petrol is the same as in Europe. You pay about $2, which is about €2. There's only one difference. You count in gallons. So our petrol is 4.5 times more as expensive as yours. That's not because it's more difficult to get petrol from the Middle East to Europe. That is because we tax it. Because we don't want people to use too much petrol. We want to get people into public transport. And on your remark on business, any solution you work on climate change should involve an active commitment of business. And there are so many positive examples of how businesses work on tackling all kinds of climate-related problems. I have many examples where business proved even to be more efficient than government. Just to give one in 2 lines, the problem is palm oil. Palm oil is destroying you. You have, every one of you has used about 10 products today that contain palm oil, and at the end of the day it's more. It's in your soap, it's in your toothpaste, everything. It's destroying the world's rainforest. If governments want to create a palm oil treaty, and believe me, I've been there in those UN negotiations, it would take us like 50 years and it would be a weak treaty. What now happened is that the main producers for palm oil, which is about 5 or so companies, sat around the table. They have about 60% of the production with these 5 huge companies like Unilever. And just on the back of an envelope, they agreed, sitting together, okay, we agree, all of us now, that after 2020 we will cut no longer pristine forest to produce palm oil. That is a very quick and dirty way of making a treaty, but it's so much more efficient than we would ever have done as governments. And that is actually saving a lot of biodiversity. I think those kind of positive examples what business can do should also be recognized.
Yep. Well, we've talked a lot about different roles. Another question from the audience. You've talked about the global south, the global north, western, eastern, developed, non-development. Should there be more discussion about intergenerational issues? Is there a generational debt that boomers owe to the next generation or vice versa? Or any thoughts about intergenerational dynamics?
Oh my God, absolutely. I started up a website a few years ago called Your Climate Legacy, and it was based on, trying to get people to think about their children and grandchildren, and it's already been noted that these are not abstract individuals, these are descendants of us all that are going to be in these out years that we so easily talk about of 2100 or even 2050 or whatever. So I think that's a big thing. I want to give a shout out to a movie that I saw recently as part of the Environmental Film Festival. It's called Little Yellow Boots. And it's a great piece by a noted documentarian whose name I've forgotten, but it's a letter to his granddaughter in the future. And it's just extremely well done, fact-based, but also dramatized, and that's really good. But yeah, I mean, there are groups like Mom's Clean Air Force and others that are trying to work that, but some days I just don't get it, why there's not enough of an intergenerational legacy. I look out at people, my own age and the older generation. God, I hate that term, but anyway, so, to me, that's what it's all about. To me, that's the number one thing that I work for in my work, day in and day out.
Absolutely. Same thing here. My daughter is 15, and I really, really am motivated to work for the next generation. Just last week, I was giving a class in Lebanon by Skype. I was asked by a teacher of a high school in Lebanon if I could teach children in Lebanon by Skype. I have never, ever not um, given speeches to classrooms whenever I was asked. I believe that is so important. It's basically, it's all about sustainability. In 1981, the Royal Society of Arts in London published for the very first time an article that explained the idea of sustainability, that you should have your economy and the inequality in the world, and the environment should be in a kind of balance. And then in 1987, the famous Brundtland Commission report came out, and that just advised to all of us in the world that our generation should make maximum use of what our planet has to offer, but we have to do it in such a way that you don't degrade the planet for the next generation. We are doing now exactly the opposite. Never in the history of mankind has there been a generation that has stolen so much of the future of the next generation. We should all be horribly ashamed of ourselves. It's even doubtful whether our children will have a better life than we had, but all of us had a better life than our parents. And that is just something we should be ashamed of. So you guys in the back there, you know, it's your future, and you have to fight for it. Like you're fighting for gun control now, as the Parkland students are doing. That is so inspiring. And if you want to live on a livable planet, you have to get organized. You have to inform yourself, you have to educate yourself, you have to get organized, you have to take initiatives, and whatever job you're later going to do in your life, whether it's in government or whether you're a good engineer or whether you're a doctor or whatever you're going to do, you will be impacted by climate change, and make sure that you're standing on the right side of history.
Yep.
Thank you. Something really brief. You know, environmental education, formal environmental education is usually done at the classrooms in the schools. We have a program that we're calling Family Saturdays. And we invite not only the kids, but the entire family to come to a restoration site to learn about the environment, to, you know, plant trees, you get connected to nature. And so they are there as a family, and the parents hear, you know, some of the issues, and of course the kids are there, and, you know, it begins the interaction among members of the family. So so we'll continue to do that, and I think, I mean, for us, has been very successful program.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. So my son graduated from this university last year, and so for a while I had a conduit of sorts. At least I tried to use him as that to try and figure out what the student generation was thinking and saying about climate change. And I didn't like all that I heard. And in reading about this in other ways, I mean, there's a certain amount in a certain segment of fatalism. And I think if you're an older person, you need to talk to a younger person about climate change. And not just ones that you know, but when the right situation arises. Like I've been at restaurants and I've asked my server about climate change. And at first they're sort of taken aback, but, you know, then they will say things that might surprise you. And I really encourage you to do that. And if anybody wants to stand up from the student segment in the audience and say anything about this, I would really like to hear that. And I think probably a lot of other people would like to. So don't be shy.
While they're gathering their courage, I think one of the things for that generation, for all of us, frankly, is that you said we're sitting here talking about climate change, an incredible amount of concern, but relatively privileged to a lot of people in the rest of the world. So I think another question that's come across when you talked about, there's a lot of people in the world that want nothing more different, more lofty than just to live like we do. And so yet we know the impact that has. So oftentimes I hear from younger people, I can do all those things. I can live in a cave, never eat meat, all those things, but how do I really think about bringing an impact, a helpful impact to help people who just want to have a good life?
But actually, before that, we have a representative of all the
Yes.
students at all the universities. But do you talk about it with each other, or do you talk about it with generations above you?
Not really, because it's kind of like the app we were talking about earlier with that reminds you that you're dying. It's kind of just like reminding you that eventually climate change is going to happen, and eventually the whole world is going to burn. It's like, there's not a lot you can do. Like you can talk about it. One more?
So on the other hand, I do. My goal is to become an environmental lawyer and get into policy, and so I actually had a lot of experience talking with my family who all voted for Trump. I don't know, and I've talked to them about it a few times and tried to kind of give them not only the sense of duty that is inevitable, but also hope in ways of solutions. I think that's what we want more to see and talk about is solutions and oh, this is what you can do. It's not all going to be shit by 2050. If you do this and that, then maybe it'll be better. I feel like most of the communication is you don't have anything else you can do. And especially like he said, we're not empowered yet, so we don't have any way to kind of, other than calling people and protesting and things like that. I think we are getting up and doing that, and I think that's definitely something that our generation is stepping up for.
Yeah, the "we are not in power" thing is interesting because, I come from a generation that sort of took power in a lot of ways. And, I think that's maybe something that you're not thinking hard enough about on this issue. And that's not to be critical. I'm just saying think harder about that.
So any other comments related to that or about helping the rest of the world get to where we need to?
Well, listening to you and think about what you can do, you have, as a community in Boulder, a unique chance to be an example in the U.S. You're rich, you're highly educated, you're sitting in a very sunny, beautiful spot in the U.S. Why don't you get together and say, we are going to be the first carbon neutral community as Boulder in the United States? You have examples in other countries, but you don't have one in the US. Spain has a whole island that is completely carbon neutral. In Germany, there's a village that's carbon neutral. Maybe you don't get there. Maybe you're not completely carbon neutral at the end of the day. But why not aim for it? It would be a thing that would, as you do in CWA, where you really unite in a way that I've never experienced in all those conferences I go to. I've never seen a place where the students and the community and the university and the business and everybody else is all coming together to create such an amazing event as CWA. Make a next chapter. Make Boulder the first or at least the most carbon neutral city. You can do it together. I'm sure that you can do it. If you cannot do it, I don't think anybody can do it. Thanks.
So I would just, as we've only got a few minutes here, any last thoughts for the audience? We've touched a lot of different things, a lot of different roles to play individually, things we can do to help encourage others, get them information. Action seems to be a theme for all of this. And let's hear from a student. Thank you.
So one question that I have when you're saying we want you guys to be empowered, we want you to do things, what are some little things that we can do or manageable things that we can do at this point, going into college or just graduating from college or wherever we're at that we can actually start changing?
Well, I'm not even the panelist, but I will say, particularly given the numbers from the last election, vote. Yeah. There were more people in this country who didn't vote. Yeah. So that's a huge one, and your generation could really help change the culture of this country, recognizing, as people say, democracy is an active sport. You've got to be a part of it.
Just another example, but I fully agree to the vote. And I'll be short because I see that you're standing up. I didn't see that when I started speaking. Just briefly, my daughter is 15. Without me knowing, she made a beautiful website of all the vegan restaurants that are around in Stockholm for everybody to find them, because that website didn't exist. And she convinced me and my wife to move from vegetarian to vegan. She is already changing the world on her own. I never encouraged her to go that way. And now she has convinced all kinds of other students at school to either eat less meat or eat a plant-based diet. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, to the question, and we are out of time, right? So, okay, so I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. So here's my parting comment is, first of all, I mean, on top of the vote thing and back to what 3 questions would you ask a candidate? And you often see lists there are a stacked list of things that people care about. Okay, healthcare, education, climate, and they bounce around or whatever. But, you know, I care about all of those, all right? Those are priorities. It doesn't mean you don't care about number 5 or don't care about number 7. So I think a question to ask a candidate is, will you vote? Will you cast votes based on climate change? Okay? Because there are all sorts of votes which are not directly on climate change, but yet they impact climate change. And that's what you want to do. So anyway, my parting shot is don't walk out of here and say, wasn't that a great session? You know, think about what you can do. Think about what organization you can join. And again, the individual action that no one will see when you turn off the lights in your house is really meaningful if millions and millions of people simply do that. So individual action and group action.
Francisco? No? Alexander, any last thoughts? Great. So I really appreciate your coming, and again, I apologize you can never get through all the comments, but the conversation has been good. I'd encourage you, seems to me one of the bottom lines here is keep the conversation going, right? Thanks for coming, thanks to CWA, and go forth and make the change. Yeah, yeah.
I don't have my camera. Let's do.
Thanks, Scott.
I used to race.
We crow. Yeah, we crow.
Okay.
But I don't have my phone is in the back.
Maybe somebody can take
Would you take a picture?